views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hi, and welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet, a weekly program providing you the latest information, resources, services, and community efforts taking place locally here in the Bronx and virtually. I'm your host, Alleyne. Coming up, a Bronx family trying to stay warm this winter caused one of the worst fires the city has seen in decades. A supervising attorney joins us for a discussion on what tenants can do if their safety is continuously being violated. Then, following the East 181st Street fire, a captain from the FDNY Fire Safety Education Unit joined me to discuss the best course of action when stuck in a life-threatening situation. Is there a way to make a rescue easier for the FDNY? After that, following the events from the United States Capitol attacks, the Bronx Documentary Center explores the event that changed American history with a photo exhibition. Did these photographers know they were putting their lives at risk? And honored for her work regarding the disabled community, one activist details her journey fighting for disabled rights and explains how you can be a better ally. Is there a right way to handle being called out? So please stick around. Open BxRx Tuesday starts now. Welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Kibin, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. Earlier this month, Bronx sites experienced the deadliest fire the city has seen in over 3 decades. The fire took the lives of 17 people, and there are several more in the hospital with life-altering injuries. Reports say the fire started due to a faulty space heater, but people are now questioning the living conditions within the building during frigid temperatures. Joining me for discussion on tenant rights is supervising attorney Justin Mort. Justin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, trying to escape very cold weather, a family used a space heater to warm up. Unfortunately, during this time of the year, this is very common. Can you explain how often families in New York City struggle to keep warm this winter?
Sadly, it's an all too common story that we hear at my office at Mobilization for Justice. According to HPD, who runs the 311 calls, they get around 100,000 unique calls, meaning 100,000 different buildings that are having heat issues. And that doesn't even include public housing, NYCHA, which is notorious for having a loss of heat and hot water during the winter months.
Now, people often voice their concerns about the lack of hot water and heat in their building during these months. Why aren't landlords supplying adequate heat and hot water to their tenants?
It comes down to cost. Often with these buildings that they only get so much amount of money coming in towards rent, and they make the decision not to spend money onto their building. And as such, the tenants suffer.
Wow. So I didn't know that was a conscious decision that they were making. So that's very interesting to know. And it's a little bit sad. But if you take a look at your screen, you can see the heat laws of our city. So I would like to break this down a little further. Can you just explain what we're seeing?
Sure. So starting October 1st, it's heat season under the laws in New York City. And what heat season means from October 1st to May 31st is that during the daytime, which is 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., if it is 55 degrees or colder outside, it must be at least 68 degrees inside. Now, during the evening hours, which is 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., inside must be heated at 62 degrees or warmer. If not, it's a violation of law.
So are the landlords following this law? We're hearing that, sometimes they're making this decision not to provide certain heat. So can we say that landlords are following this law?
Many landlords do follow this law and provide heat. Unfortunately, there are also many landlords, including the city of New York through public housing, that do not.
So we typically see this in housing units that are occupied by low-income tenants. At this point, should it be considered discrimination or even neglect? And are we seeing these same cases in buildings with higher income tenants?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. So, legally, discrimination has a very specific definition. But the reality is that most low income renters are often Black or brown. And they are often subject to some of the worst housing conditions that we see, the most tragic being the most recent fire in the Bronx. And so when we're looking at how this treatment is happening, I'm reminded of a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. as we just celebrated his birthday, where he thought it would be easier to solve the voting rights in our country than it would be to make sure that Black and brown people could have safe housing. And that has kind of rung true of what we've seen. So is it discrimination? In practice, yes. Consciously, I don't know. But what I do know is that people are not investing in their buildings, that they're not listening to people complain about heat, and instead blaming it on the tenants. And that is putting people's lives at danger, and that can't be allowed to continue.
Now, according to an article from Bloomberg, older buildings with cheaper rents can be grandfathered into building codes that don't require as many fire safety measures as newer, more expensive buildings. Have you found this to be true? And if so, is this even legal?
That is legal, and this is a very common issue with the law. So when you live in an older building and then the laws change, two things happen. Either older buildings can be grandfathered in, meaning they're not subject to the new law unless they go through a major renovation. And the reason being is to actually protect tenants in a way, because if a building built in 1910 had to come up to 2020 standards, it would cost significant amounts of money. And often in for-profit housing, those costs to renovate and improve are going to be passed down to the tenants, to which they can't afford those rents. But we also see this happening in buildings that are not that old. That fire happened in a building that was built in the 1970s, which is hardly old for New York housing stock. So we see this across the spectrum.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Okay. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I thought like a building in 1970 was considered like a little bit older, but I guess like it's for much, much older buildings. So thank you for, kind of clarifying that. The apartment building located at 333 East 181st Street had a history of serious violations related to heat, ventilation, and other safety issues. Of course, everyone, needs housing and we want everyone to be housed. But how are these buildings allowed to operate in such horrendous conditions?
Because the city doesn't take action and the landlord does not voluntarily improve it. My office has been representing several people in that building, and we represent tenants across the city who are asking for one thing: to have safe housing. And often the landlords refuse to do it or they put up delays. And the only way to force them is either for people to take them to court, as organizations like my Mobilization for Justice does, or for the city, whether it's the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD, to sue them, or perhaps even on a greater scale, we see action by the Attorney General's office. But unless there is enforcement, people are going to continue to suffer.
So now we know that people need to kind of make their voice heard. And I do hear that complaints to landlords and managements often go ignored. What is the best course of action for someone who's paying to live somewhere to get their landlords to listen to them? And what can they do if their safety is continuously being violated?
So at our website, we have a list of things that tenants can do, and part of your choices depend on what type of housing you live in. That's one thing that almost all tenants can do is call 311 and file that complaint. Um, First, you should talk to your landlord and give them the opportunity to do the right thing, and hopefully they do. If they don't, call 311. And if that doesn't work, you can escalate it. For tenants who are rent control or rent stabilized, they can file a DHCR rent reduction order and actually prevent the landlord from increasing their rent until the repairs are made. For other tenants, such as in public housing or those who are unregulated, they also, or rent stabilized, can also bring a court case called an HP in housing court, and actually sue the landlord to do those repairs. Originally, housing court was created to make sure people had safe housing to bring these types of cases. But unfortunately, what we see is only about 6% of all housing court cases are about repairs. And I would love to see that number increase by tenants asserting their rights and making sure that they and their families can live safely in their homes.
Now, do these rights also apply to, or these like things that they can do, does this also apply to those living in NYCHA apartments?
Absolutely. So NYCHA tenants have their own hotline that can be called. And if NYCHA fails to make those repairs, then the 400,000 people who live in NYCHA have every right to sue NYCHA in housing court, just like any other tenant.
Oh, wow. I think that's so important. And a lot of people, unfortunately, don't know that they have those options or are afraid to take those options. You talked a little bit about your organization and what you do. Can you tell us, how accessible it is to people, and is it free?
Yeah, so organizations like mine, Mobilization for Justice, provides free legal services to tenants in New York City. And if people are looking to get connected with an attorney, they can also call 311 and get that information. And if you're looking for my organization, please visit our website, mobilizationforjustice.org. And we have a Get Help button where we help people, whether it's housing, immigration, debt collection, foreclosure, get the help that they need for free.
Now, you talked a little bit about taking legal action, and I want to know, is there other ways that we can hold the city accountable for letting these issues slide or go unnoticed? And I think a lot of people want questions from, those in power on like why we waited till this moment to actually kind of have these conversations on a larger scale.
Sadly, it often takes a catalyst of tragedy to make sure that progress is made. So if people would like to see the city do more, then you should be contacting your city council member. You should be contacting Mayor Adams, because those are the ones in charge of the money and the people running the city agencies that can do that enforcement.
And I also want to add that, as we mentioned previously, that it is predominantly Black and Brown people who are experiencing some of the harsher conditions when it comes to buildings. I also feel like these communities, for the Bronx 181st Street fire, it was a large immigrant community. I think that sometimes people may be afraid or scared. What would you say to encourage these people to kind of really speak up and take charge of what's happening?
Sadly, some of those who are in the worst conditions are often the most marginalized in our society, but they have rights as do every other tenant in New York City. But those rights are only mean something if people are willing to stand up and take action. And organizations that provide free attorneys like Mobilization for Justice, the Urban Justice Center, and many of my colleagues around the city are willing to help. So please document your problems with pictures. Take heat logs if you don't have heat. Contact your landlord and keep a record of those contacts. And if they refuse to do the right thing, you too have the right to bring them to court because you deserve to live in safe housing.
And can you just quickly tell us, how do you actually keep a record?
Sure. So depending on the type of condition, one way to keep a record is if you have a thermometer in your house to actually keep track of if they are not following the rules about the heat. So that way, if there's a question of, well, what proof do you have? You've kept your notes. And if you have other problems, taking pictures with your camera phone is a great way to get evidence, such as mold or water leaks or maybe rodents. By having that proof, if someone tries to disregard what you're saying it's not real or you're causing the problem, that you then have evidence that you can show as a government or as a court to prove that these problems are real and that they need to be fixed.
Justin, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me about this. Can you just tell us, how can people stay up to date with you and learn more about their tenant rights?
Absolutely. My organization has a great website, mobilizationforjustice.org, or you can follow us on Twitter at MFJ Legal. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at @Lamort_ESQ, where I spend a lot of time trying to make sure people are informed about their rights as tenants.
Thank you so much. We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.
We know that people are dealing with the health crisis, but there's also a lot of food insecurity.
We're giving out healthy food options, and that's what's key here.
If you're a senior, you have a disability, they'll actually deliver meals to you.
The residents are anxious, they're worried, they're scared, they want to be tested.
When things were happening in our community and we couldn't get the help.
There's almost a presumption of criminality that attaches to your skin color.
The site will prioritize those who are at highest risk in the population.
If you feel symptoms and you'd like to visit one of these COVID-19 testing sites here in the Bronx, you may call the State Health Department's hotline.
Important to note about this site is no reservations are needed. This is a walk-in clinic.
A lot of us are out of work and looking for something to do.
We have the machinery and the skills to make large scales of these masks and gowns.
Take care of your people. It's going to go way further than we actually can understand.
Right now, employees like myself are just adjusting. to the new reality.
Reporting from BronxNet, this is Shuran.
Welcome back. A malfunctioning electric space heater caused one of the deadliest fires the city has seen in over 3 decades, taking the lives of 17 people. Following the devastating Bronx East 181st Street fire, Captain Michael Kozo from the FDNY Fire Safety Education Unit joins me to discuss the best course of action when stuck in such a dangerous and life-threatening situation. Captain, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, as we know, a faulty space heater started the fire, and it's unfortunately very common. What should people look for when dealing with these types of heating units?
So when you're using a space heater, you want to make sure that you're inspecting it before you use it to make sure that there's no wires exposed, that there's no frayed wires or anything like that. You also, when you're purchasing one, you want to look for one that is approved by a underwriter's laboratory. You'll see their label, which I'm holding here. You'll see their marking on the space heater itself. And you want to make sure that that has it. That says that the space heater was tested and inspected and is approved to be used. Also, you want to look for one that has an automatic shut-off feature to it. Should the space heater tip over by mistake on its face, it will automatically turn off. You will have to lift it up and then turn it back on again manually. And then just a few safety rules you want to keep in mind. 3 feet around a space heater should be full. A space heater should be plugged directly into the wall outlet. You shouldn't be using extension cords or anything else.
Now, was this a fire that could have been put out by residents if it was caught early?
We don't typically recommend fires. One important fact that people don't really realize is that a fire doubles in size every 30 to 60 seconds. So if you're really not prepared to extinguish a fire properly, the fire is going to grow and it's going to get worse and it's going to really cut down on your time to escape safely. So we really don't recommend that throughout, maybe gotten behind your walls and you're not really sure about that. So we do recommend that you call 911 as fast as possible.
Okay, well, that's really great to know. I think it's important to understand that these families were just trying to stay warm. Many families use space heaters, and sometimes people are even using their ovens, as well as many other things to stay warm. How dangerous are these methods, and what are some safer alternatives?
So we definitely don't recommend using the oven for heat. We have heard people boiling water to try and get that steam. Again, not a good method of heating. We don't recommend any of that. The use of a space heater is not a problem, provided, again, that the space heater is used properly and that we're following the proper precautions. So once again, a space heater should have 3 feet around it, clear of anything combustible. When you're using a space heater, technically you should be running the space heater in the room that you want to heat while you're still awake. Once you go to sleep, you should be turning off. A space heater is something that heats. So any item that heats or cools draws a tremendous amount of power and needs to be plugged directly into the wall outlet. So you should not be using any extension cords or power strips or anything else.
Now, I really want to know the difference between a gas fire versus electric fire versus a flame, and how should we distinguish these fires if possible?
So again, I don't think that we're really going to have, or the typical person is going to really have the time to try and distinguish what type of fire they're dealing with. Really, what you need to know is what to do if there is a fire. You need to have a plan of escape. You need to know the type of building that you live in, because the type of building you live in is going to determine how you're going to get out of that building. Yes, if you have an electrical fire versus a fire of, including a couch or something like that, it is going to be a little bit of a different approach in your home. You want to use a fire extinguisher that's compatible to put out all three types of fires, whether it be a gasoline fire or an electrical fire, something like that. But keep in mind that even if you do put out a fire that started from electrical, an outlet or something like that, as long as there's still power to that wire or that appliance, that is still going to be live, and there is always that chance of it continuing to spark and start a fire again. So you may put out the flames, but if it's still plugged in, it's still live, and that fire will start again.
So what is the first thing people should do if they see a fire spreading in their home or their apartment unit?
So the short answer would be to get out, and call 911. Obviously, it's not always that simple. You need to have a plan of escape. You need to know the type of building you live in, because that is going to determine how you're going to escape, or whether you escape at all. In a high-rise, in a fireproof building of any type, whether it be a low-rise or a high-rise fireproof building, if the fire is in your apartment, obviously you're going to get out, you're going to call 911. You want to make sure that the door closes behind you. If you live anywhere else in that building and the fire is not in your apartment, it's usually safer to stay inside your apartment rather than try and enter this hallway where you're not sure if the person left the door open. Maybe there's smoke, there may be heat, fire in that hallway or in that staircase. You don't want to expose yourself to any of that. So it's usually safer to stay inside your apartment in a fireproof building. You may want to throw some damp towels underneath the door to prevent any smoke from coming in. But other than that, you're usually safer inside your apartment, as opposed to a non-fireproof building, which, whether the fire is in your apartment or in someone else's apartment, you need to get out of that building. Again, if the fire is in your apartment, close the door behind you to make sure that you keep that fire contained within your apartment. But regardless of where you are in that building, a non-fireproof building, you have to get out, which is why you'll see the fire escapes. You always have a secondary means of egress if that fire or smoke is in the hallway or the staircase or anything else.
Now, how can people actually know if they're living in a fireproof building or not?
So it will be labeled in the common area or the lobby of the building, stating whether the building is fireproof or non-fireproof. They also use the words combustible and non-combustible. So just keep that in mind. Non-combustible meaning fireproof, and combustible being non-fireproof. You'll either see that will be a little write-up underneath as to what you should do if there is a fire in the building. You can also look on the Department of Buildings website and put in the address, and it will tell you what type of building it is.
Now, you talked about the door a little bit, and I think it's a huge part of why we saw the fire that we did. There's been a lot of concern about the auto shutting door in regards to this fire. Can you explain this and possibly what went wrong that day?
So in these fireproof buildings, the doors have a spring loaded in them, and once you open the door will automatically close behind you. Typically, that is the case, and it is hard to tell, and I believe the fire marshals are still investigating what exactly happened with the door. I haven't heard any word on that yet, but what can happen is the spring over time may get worn out and just doesn't operate properly, so it will not allow the door to close on its own. There's several things that can go wrong with that door. And again, I really haven't gotten the word from the fire marshals on exactly what happened with the door, so I can't really speak on that.
Mm-hmm. Now, NBC reports that the apartment door should have been closed on its own in accordance with city code and fire safety protocol. Based on what you do know, how do tenants ensure that they're living in a building that follows protocol?
So again, something like that, right? You should know what entails the fire code, what that whole fire code entails. What does it mean to be in a fireproof building? And this all goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is knowing the type of what that means. What does it mean to live in a fireproof building? Does it mean that my doors are supposed to self-close? Does it mean that that the fire won't spread as long as the door is closed in the apartment where the fire is in? Does it mean that I should stay in my apartment or should I go? These are all things that are based on knowing the type of building you live in. And I think that's exactly where it starts. So the self-closing doors is one part of that fireproof building. And if you notice that your door is not self-closing, then you need to take that to, the board or, whoever's in charge of the maintenance of that building immediately.
A very important detail to note is that these people actually died due to smoke inhalation, and smoke can be just as deadly as fire. What should people do when faced with this obstacle?
So if you're faced with smoke for whatever reason, you need to get down as low as possible. That's usually where the air is going to be a little bit more tenable, where you will be able to breathe a little bit easier. Again, you're probably not going to be able to see. If you do get low before the smoke is disturbed, you may be able to see a little bit, but once the smoke is disturbed by wind or somebody moving through it, the smoke will start to go all over, and it's going to be very, very difficult to see. So what you can do is stay as low as possible, hand on a wall to guide you, because your hand on a wall so that you know exactly where you're going. Once you take your hand off that wall, you could be going in circles and not even know it because you really have no idea where you're going. So if you keep your hand on the wall, you'll start to feel certain things. You'll feel a door, you may feel your couch, and you'll know exactly where you are in your room or in your apartment.
Well, that's a really interesting, tip. So thank you so much for sharing that. Is there any way to make a rescue easier for the FDNY and the victim?
So one of the ways that would make a rescue easier for us is by closing the door behind you when you leave. What happens is if you leave your door open, the fire and the smoke and the heat spread out of your apartment and start to contaminate the hallway and then the staircase. As we're coming into the building, we're now faced with all of this smoke and gases and heat the second we come in, which is making it a lot more difficult for us to get to where we have to go to make any rescues. So by closing that door behind you, you're keeping all of those gases and heat and fire inside the apartment, which makes it a lot easier for us to get in. We could go right up to the apartment door without facing any of those obstacles.
Now, can you just tell everyone how they can stay educated on fire safety? This was super important, and I'm sure there's so much more to learn.
So you can always go and visit our website at fdnysmart.org. On that website, you can also request presentations from my unit, the Fire Safety Education Unit. We go out and do in-person presentations as well, and we will go over what you need to do in a fire and all different types of fire safety tips in regards to residential fires. We'll go over the most common causes of fires and how we can avoid those from happening. And all of the tips and safety information that we share is all available on that website as well.
All right. Captain, thank you so much for joining me. We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.
Donations came pouring in here at Monroe College's Houston Hall for the victims of a deadly 5-alarm that took the lives of 17 people as smoke and flames filled this 19-story building here at 333 East 181st Street right before 11 a.m. on Sunday morning, with the New York City Fire Department sharing the cause of faulty space heater that ignited. This is Ashley Hall, who drove in from Harlem.
Once I knew that there was a place where you could bring things to donate and help, I was more than happy to do so.
Located at 2375 Jerome Avenue, the college agreed to open the space as a makeshift evacuation center. There, the American Red Cross was on hand with the New York City Department of Emergency Management.
I came to make a donation, try to help out in the mean I can.
Yesterday afternoon, we received a call that the city could use space to help coordinate the relief efforts for all the families that are affected. So we offered this building, Houston Hall, and we offered our staff, and we've been accepting donations today. And, it's in the face of a very difficult situation, it's nice to see the members of the community coming out to help.
Help following an unthinkable tragedy as area hospitals took in over 30 who were in the building, with over a dozen listed in critical condition.
One loss is one loss too many. The kids is another one. That just hurts.
Only 10 years old, this victim, Ube Bolima, who lives with her family above the third floor, shared she was awakened by a family member.
it was my mom, my dad, and me. We were sleeping, so I was just sleeping, and my sister was just tapping me. She was like, "Oh, there's a fire. We need to get out."
Now staying with an aunt, her entire family is safe, she says, but others here are desperately looking for theirs.
My daughter, with her boyfriend, and we can't find her. We have no information, can't find nothing.
Karen Benjamin is the mother of 38-year-old Doral Anderson from apartment 13R. The family shared she is disabled and has not been in communication since Friday. She lives with her boyfriend, Ramel Thompson.
She's handicapped and she's in a wheelchair, so we're just hoping that, she's still alive.
The American Red Cross is asking those trying to locate family members to call 311. Here at Monroe College, Arlene Makoko for BronxNet.
Welcome back. Last year, on January 6th, an angry mob stormed the U.S. Capitol following the 2020 presidential election results. A year after the riot, the Bronx Documentary Center explores the event that changed American history with an exhibition titled Storming the Capitol, which opens to the public on January 29th. Joining me for discussion on the exhibition are photographers Shuran Huang and Gabriela Bhaskar. Thank you both for joining me.
Hi, and thanks for having me here today.
Yeah, so can we just start off, can you tell us about your collaboration with the Bronx Documentary Center in regards to this exhibition? And Shuran, we'll just start with you.
Cool, yeah. So I think at the end of December, so I think the Bronx Documentary Center staff, Cynthia Rivera, she reached out to me asking if I have some work around the, like the January 6th insurrection, and even just like the events before that leading up to the January 6th insurrection to show to them. So I just sent them like a collection of work, and they end up just picking two from that collection, yeah.
And Gabriela?
It was a very similar situation, Cynthia. I used to teach at the Bronx Documentary Center and have had a fellowship there, and Cynthia reached out knowing that I had been in DC that day. And I also just sent over a collection of images, and they selected a couple from there.
Awesome. Now, Storming the Capitol will showcase the work of several photojournalists who captured the chaos that happened on January 6th. Shuran, what can viewers expect to see when they just visit the exhibition?
I would say this is such a collection of images from all talented photographer and photojournalists in this industry. So I would say each of us has contributed to a historic moments of the United States, and including me. And every one of us has such unique photographic style. So I would say viewers are expected to see, they really expect to see images from just a collection of really talented photojournalists with amazing images. Yeah.
So we don't get to speak or hear from photographers often because they usually tell their stories through pictures. Gabriela, can you detail your experience capturing these photos?
Yeah, I think a lot of us had gone into DC on the 6th or that weekend, or those couple days, I guess, knowing that there was going to be some kind of violence. In the months leading up to January 6th, there were a lot of fighting in the streets of DC, and a lot of the organizations and groups that were going to be gathering on the 6th had already been coming to DC and showing us that. I think the manner in which it happened was really surprising. I think there were many times during the day where I looked up at the Capitol and expected the police or law enforcement to really hold back the line. But it was really alarming, I think, to be around in a situation where there were quite literally Nazi symbols being displayed, and people identifying us as press and getting upset, and then trying to figure out how to manipulate oneself out of that situation in a really packed crowd. I mean, I think a lot of us have like varying memories from that day depending on where we were also, but it was really a calculation of like how much risk one is going to take to get the picture that you want, and where you can be to get the photos, what was really happening on the ground. There was really a lot to think about that day.
Now, I love that you brought up the term risks because that kind of leads into my next question. Just, as we can see from many of the photos, some of them taken from other photographers, photojournalists are often in the middle of very dangerous situations. I think, as many people know, January 6th resulted in many injuries and even a few deaths. Shuran, you were on assignment for that day for the National Geographic. Looking back, did you expect it to become so violent and that you could be putting your safety at risk?
Oh, totally not. You know what is funny is like I was actually on assignments for the Washington Post earlier in the day, and I didn't get the call from National Geographic until I think afternoon. Um, so the photo editor called me, and apparently they like all those like, major outlets have seen like the situation's getting worse and worse. The photo editor Mallory, yeah, at National Geographic, she called me and asking me if I will be, comfortable actually photographing such like a dangerous and risky situation. And to be honest, that was my first National Geographic photo assignments. And of course, like as a freelance photojournalist, I would always say yes, right? And I was also just like curious, like what's actually happening. And then I picked up my camera, and I don't have any kind of like safety, like helmet and stuff. So I went to my friend's house and grabbed kind of like a bicycle helmet and put it on myself. And I have some goggles that I use usually for like running. So I just like wear them and just go there. And when I got there, I just felt like, oh, I probably shouldn't wear that much gear to make myself look like a media person and become the target. And all of a sudden, someone asked me, they just walked by and saw me have this, I guess I look like Asian and Chinese and following, former President Trump's accusation of China virus. And I just got scared but I felt like because my responsibility as a photojournalist is to document the moment, so I just like kept going and kept approaching the Capitol Hill and just didn't even worry too much. But definitely, yes, I was very, very scared.
Wow. And Gabby, you talked about it a little bit, but did you feel the same way?
Yeah, I think as documentarians, we often like make this calculation about whether or not what is happening in front of us is really worth the risk that we're going to take. And I think that day, something completely historic was happening before us. And so that, yeah, I mean, that was definitely a calculation that I had made, like how much risk am I willing to take? I wasn't on assignment that day. I had been documenting the aftermath of the election and been doing some work on a long-term documentary project, and had shifted gears because that frankly wasn't going very well, and approached the Capitol to see that at that point, the bleachers for the inauguration had just been breached. And so, yeah, I mean, there was definitely times that I was definitely worried for most of it, but I also had friends who I was staying with who were in the Capitol, and I was frankly more worried about them because at some point, we found out that Ashley Babbitt had been shot, which means that there were live rounds in there, and I also knew that a lot of them hadn't brought their vests in. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I was worried for myself, but I was also worried for my colleagues that I knew were inside the Capitol.
Well, we all know the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I actually want to take a deeper look into some of the photos you took that day and some of the photos that are in the exhibit and just see what you have to say about them. Okay. So, Sharon, we're going to start with you. We have a photo here, and I believe it's very popular amongst viewers in the media because it really captures the essence of the state of the country. Can you just explain what was happening in the photo?
Sure, yeah. So this photo was actually not taken on January 6th, but was this photo was taken on a day, I think a Trump rally like in December 2020. Um, I remember I was walking around in the rally and like seeing everybody like, of course, like carrying different kind of flags and weapons. And that was one moment I remember on the other side of the flag. I actually saw a Trump supporter basically was wearing a really, Trump-like costume. And I was like, oh, I wonder if he would like stand in line and actually wanted to take a photo of the flag. And of course, he did. I think this kind of reviews part of our responsibility as a photojournalist is actually to anticipate a moment, like oftentimes we have to wait at a scene and anticipate what is going to happen. And of course, we also have to, and another part of our responsibility is to carry curiosity every day. If you cover any kind of news events, how do you make a photographic like moment to look interesting, right? So I remember that was such a sunny day. The light was hitting on the flag. So all the photojournalists was lining up on the other side of the flag, trying to take a photo of people, like Trump supporters, like taking photos of the flag. I was just curious. I wonder if there's a shadow on the other side of the flag. And of course, I was waiting for this Trump supporter. At his turn, he was like he was like posing like this and everything. And so I walk around to the back of the flag, and of course I saw a shadow of him posing like this. So I was like, oh, this is such a great moment. And then also like you can see some of the people on the sides, they're also Trump supporter. The way that they react to the flag and people like that Trump supporter like posing for the photo was kind of like really interesting. It's just like a photo with a lot of dynamic going on. Yeah.
Now, you also have a photo from National Geographic that was on January 6th. Can you just quickly tell us, like, what that was about?
Yeah, sure. So I remember that day, as close as I got, so does everybody else. We kind of just lost our phone connection. Like I couldn't send out a message. I kept seeing every now and then, kept seeing like messages coming in, checking in with me and to see if I was safe. And then I was just kind of like what Gabby was just saying. Like I was thinking if I should even get closer. So I stopped at one point because all of a sudden I heard a loud sound and somebody tried to like broke it. I guess a collection of people tried to broke into one of the entry of the Capitol Hill. And I kind of just stopped and wanted to see if it kind of like an overview scene of the Capitol, how it's gonna like, right? You'll probably see a different version of that. And yeah, I just feel like that was such a moment to see a landmark of democracy at the United States just was bridged. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Now, Gabrielle, we're going to talk about some of your photos as well. You have this one photo where we see an American flag and, people have their hands up. Can you quickly tell us what was happening in this photo?
Yeah, this was along the outskirts of the main violence. And I think one of the things that was really striking to me that day was the sense of duty that people felt to be doing what they were doing. And there was a moment where this massive US flag was being like pulled over the crowd. And I kind of, similarly to Shuran, had anticipated that people would in some way try to interact with it and made that photo. But ultimately, it really was to me about this really strange feeling that I had that people really were trying to protect democracy and protect the United States, but ultimately their work did the opposite. So yeah, I mean, that was what was happening in this moment. And
And now for your next photo, we see a man wearing a blue outfit, a very interesting blue outfit. Can you tell us what made you want to take that photo?
It's actually an elderly woman who was standing there. And yeah, I think one of the things that was striking to me that, happened that day was, as a person of color, I was very aware of the symbolism that was happening around me. I mean, um, a lot of Nazi symbols, a lot of white nationalist symbols, a lot of the groups that I had been following also like wear tattoos. And I think that one of the things that I noticed was that there were smaller contingencies of diversity in this crowd ethnically. And so there were a group of Vietnamese people. And this woman was standing there like so proudly, and I thought it was really striking amongst the crowd. And she was shouting quite a lot, like "Stop the steal," different phrases that had sort of become like landmarks of this whole day and campaign since.
Wow. Well, I really appreciate both of you guys taking the time to speak with me about this. We're going to put on the screen how people can stay in touch with you and see some more of your work, and that the exhibition will be on display January 29th. Once again, thank you both for joining me.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
having me.
Yeah, thank you for having me too.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday. Welcome back. Recently honored for her work as an activist for people with disabilities, now this next 2021 honoree, Daphne Frias, joins me for discussion on her work and where it's taken her. Before we jump into the interview, we're going to view a short clip of Daphne discussing ways you can be a better ally. Let's take a look.
So my first tip is don't ignore someone's disability. I know right off the bat, if you meet somebody with a noticeable disability, you may feel a little bit uncomfortable bringing it up, and you may think the best thing to do is actually just ignore it, but I promise you it's actually the opposite. We are so often living proudly and authentically as ourselves, and we want people to acknowledge that. So if you're wanting to avoid awkward situations, I say the best bet is just ask someone if they're comfortable enough to talk about their disability, and most often than not, we are.
Daphne, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope you're having a great day.
Thank you so much. So, as you mentioned, people with disabilities are often living proudly and authentically as themselves. Can you tell us about the work you've done as an activist for members of this community?
Sure. So I was diagnosed with cerebral palsy at the age of 3. And ever since then, my mom has raised me to be super proud of my disability and everything that I am, and really helped me understand that it's a superpower rather than a death sentence. And a lot of my work is around helping others feel and believe the same thing, especially trying to bridge the gap between able bodied individuals and my disabled siblings, and helping others understand that disability doesn't have to be something inherently negative, but something powerful and positive, and that disabled people can achieve anything that they put their minds to.
Now, society often labels people from oppressed communities as activists whenever they speak up for themselves, but you proudly represent and speak up for your community. When did you decide to make the decision to take on this role and be like identified as an activist?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, any person who is organizing and fighting for the community, that makes you someone who is powerful and is a leader. And I think the role as an activist is not necessarily for your community, but it's for making sure that the outside world can know about your community and make sure that they understand that your community's voices are powerful and that they exist. So really my role as an organizer and activist is being that megaphone for my community, because we already have powerful voices. I'm not trying to be a voice for them. I'm trying to amplify the voices that already exist and make sure that we can go living our best lives, making sure that we are heard and we are proudly included in everything that happens.
Now, you also proudly identify as Latina, specifically Dominican. In my personal career, I've explored the intersectionality between, being a person of color and disabled. I'm curious to know what your experience has been like and if this was something that you noticed in your work as well.
100%, and I'm so glad you've had experience in that intersection. For me, and I think for many folks within the Latinx Hispanic community, we know that disability is often heavily stigmatized and is seen as something incredibly negative, sometimes even something that can be prayed away or sort of ignored. And I've really tried within my family and then within the community as a whole to say there is no need for us to sort of tiptoe around disability. There's no need for us to, try home remedies to get rid of disabilities. Disabilities are something that make us whole. And I think if you ask the majority of disabled folks, their disability is something that they're most proud of. And really trying to have those tough conversations within a community, especially within the Hispanic community, is something I'm really, really uh, proud of doing. And I think it comes from the fact that there is a language barrier. So how do we sort of transform our language to talk positively about disability and change the way that our language inherently views disability?
Now, I like that you mentioned that because a huge part of your activism is education and teaching. What's something you feel we as a society have to learn or are struggling to learn when it comes to being allies with people with disabilities? You talked about language, and I feel like that's a huge one. But can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. I think we have these like funny sayings that are just embedded within our language, like, oh, that person is psycho, or the way that we talk about mental health. We use these heavily loaded words, and mental health in itself is a disability. And I think that that isn't a characteristic that's often associated with mental health. Um, and I think a huge part of the way that we become allies is by trying to make sure the language that we use is not inflammatory and is inherently and subconsciously subjugating these communities to negative stigma. So, really taking a step back and being like, hey, what's the language I'm using? Is this harming communities? Is this marginalizing communities without me even realizing? And I mean, we have a long way to go because everyone uses these phrases. And even when I was younger, before I started my work, of course, I can be accused of the same thing just because it was commonplace and you see people doing it on TV, your friends and family are doing it. But now, as I've gotten older, I really realized, hey, these words are harmful and they not only harm, me as someone with mental illness, but it harms my community and it's a huge detriment to us. So, how can we change our language as a whole to be more inclusive?
Now you talked about it briefly in the video earlier, but I think this would be a great time to talk about how would you, how do we as a society learn how to be better allies? And one of that is like you said with language, and some of it is ingrained in us, like we've grown up with that. But what would you say society has to learn about being a better ally to people with disabilities, and also, handling being called out, by someone who has disabilities?
Sure. I think there's this bad misconception that disabled people just go around like being angry all the time, and we're just like angry at the world for living in these, multiple different situations that we may be facing. And I think that frustration comes from the fact that disabled people historically and categorically have been seen as invisible or not seen at all. So imagine going your whole life existing and then kind of feeling like no one can see you. So I think, as this graphic points out, really, in being an ally, it's about seeing us wholly. So much of the encounters I have with people when I first meet them, they try to tiptoe and act like they don't see my disability, and it's like, newsflash, it's not a secret. I know it's there. So a huge part of being an ally is embracing someone else's disability. And if you're unsure how to do that, the best way is to ask. Ask someone's comfort level. Are you comfortable talking about this? If not, can you guide me to how better support you? But I think the best way to become an ally is to have conversations with disabled folk instead of pretending like we don't exist, or like if you stand too close to us, you're going to catch a disability in some way. I promise that's not going to happen. So try to engage us more in conversation, because you'd be really surprised what you find out.
Thank you so much for that, and kind of, sharing and talking about that. I agree 100% that like people say, like, you don't ignore the issue. That's not how you go through things. You actually face it head on. I would like to know quickly, how do you address people not handling being called out too well?
Sure. I always say that, like, when someone has a negative response, it's because something in the way that you've addressed them is triggering something that they feel insecure about. And I say, like, the best way to become an ally for the disabled community, or an ally of any community in general, really, is to be committed to dismantling the multiple isms for disability, the ableism that exists internally within us. So it's going to be an uncomfortable process. And yeah, you might feel attacked sometimes, but I think in those moments of being attacked, you got to step back and say, hey, why did that person come up to me in the first place? Because I promise you, unless you were being a troll and being super nasty, our intention was never to make you feel uncomfortable. It's to give you a moment of education and reflection. So it's time to step back and be like, hey, how can I incorporate some of what they said, and what really was the root of what they were trying to get across, and how can I take that into my personal life and try to be a better ally. So I think it's really about reflection and being committed to unlearning some of the subconscious stuff that we've all had in our brains around disability.
Daphne, thank you so much for joining me. Can you quickly tell everyone how they can stay up to date with you?
Sure. I am all over the internet. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Frias_Daphne, or at my personal website, daphnefrias.com.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's all for our show today. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Kibin, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.